Here's a question that most leaders never stop to ask. Why do smart, experienced professionals forget so much of what they learn? And why does it keep showing up at the worst possible moment? The uncomfortable truth is we mistake familiarity for mastery, confidence for competence, and exposure for understanding. And the cost of that mistake shows up everywhere in meetings where ideas can't be recalled, in high stakes conversations where thinking collapses, and in training investments that look good on paper but never translate into performance. This episode matters because learning is no longer a support function, it's a competitive advantage. And today's guest is one of the clearest voices cutting through the noise. Dr. Megan Sumeracki is a tenured professor at Rhode Island College and co-founder of the Learning Scientists, an organization dedicated to translating cognitive science into practical guidance for educators and professionals. She's also the best-selling author of several books, including Understanding How We Learn. During today's conversation, we expose why intuition fails us, why so many popular learning beliefs quietly sabotage our performance, and what science actually says about how to get learning to stick. So if you care about performance, decision making, and learning that transfers, this conversation is for you. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome to the program, Megan.
Thank you for having me. It's really nice to talk to lots of different types of people who do lots of different types of things.
I love it. Well, I always like to start each episode with our listeners learning more about you and what got you interested in this work.
Yeah, so I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, and I study learning and memory. If we go really far back, when I first started college, I actually wanted to be a lawyer and majored in psychology because I thought it was interesting and maybe related, and figured out pretty quickly that I didn't actually want to be on Law and Order, but still found psychology to be interesting. And I ended up trying lots of different areas and stumbled upon cognitive psychology because I just was so excited about helping primarily students with learning and school, because I loved learning and school so much. And there were so many things that I didn't know when I was in school in K through 12 that I was learning as basically an upper level undergraduate student. And so I stuck with cognitive psychology and continued engaging in research and became a professor from there. So my life really has revolved around learning from beginning to end.
So I love to explore more of this gap that a lot of professionals and adults have between confidence and competence. And it shows up everywhere, especially among, I would say, leaders. So when someone says, hey, look, Megan, I already know how to learn, I need to learn other skills. How do you respond to that? Because inevitably they probably did pretty good in school and they think they're a good learner.
Yeah, so learning how to learn effectively can be helpful in learning all of those other skills, right? So this doesn't have to be like an either or to me. You're either learning how to learn or you're learning some other skill. Rather, learning how to learn and applying those skills as you continue your professional development and continue to pick up new skills that you need to learn can make you more effective and efficient. And so if you learn how to learn and you keep using those strategies, you'll really get a nice kind of return on your time investment there in the form of saved time in the future. Many of us did well in school. We were able to get through, and we can do that sometimes without doing something in the most effective or the most efficient way. And I really do think that at some point, everybody reaches a level where there's just so much that they have to learn and so much that they have to keep track of, that doing things in a way that isn't as efficient really starts to take its toll. And so some of this is about learning effectively, but it's also about learning effectively in an efficient way. And that's where I think we save time and gain from our investment.
Well, I've said it many times too, that learning how to learn more effectively is the meta skill for this century because it accelerates every other skill, like you mentioned. It's that underlying factor that really is going to position you better for success, regardless of your choice of endeavor or career. And we can acknowledge, right, that there is confidence, and the confidence comes from genuine success, that they've achieved a lot, and it's reasonable to assume their learning approach is working. But what I've noticed from the research, a consistent finding is that Humans are poor judges of their own learning. We mistake feelings of fluency and familiarity with true mastery, meaning we can see it and say, yes, that's familiar, but we can't recall it.
The problem is that strategies that feel good in the moment are not the ones that tend to produce durable, long-term learning. And then on the flip side, the ones that feel difficult in the moment and the ones that actually make us feel like maybe we're not learning as well, those are the ones that are actually the ticket. Those are the strategies that really help us in the long run. So intuition really leads us astray, unfortunately, and it's that mismatch that really creates a problem for many of us. It's very difficult when you're experiencing something feeling easy and feeling like you've mastered it. It's hard to ignore that and think, well, just because it feels good right now doesn't mean that it's going to feel this good in a couple of days or a couple of weeks or so on.
Well, and you mentioned intuition, so let's move into that because most of us choose our strategies based on what feels right in the moment, based on our intuition. Expand more on some of those problems that we run into when we lean too heavily on intuition for our learning.
Yeah. So our systems rely on these experiential cues that are not the best in terms of figuring out how well we'll remember something and be able to use it down the line. So if you're reading content, and one of the most popular strategies that my students tell me that they use, and that I think a lot of people outside of school use as well, is repeatedly reading information or reading and highlighting and rereading what's been highlighted or reading the cliff notes, whatever that may be. And what happens when you read something repeatedly is you do start to maybe comprehend it a little bit better. And those words become familiar. And that familiarity leads to this fluency in your processing. And it's that familiarity, that fluency that leads you to think, aha, I've seen this before. I know it really well. That must mean that I'm doing great in terms of learning and remembering. But what you're really getting good at is reading those particular words on the page. When they're gone, that fluency and familiarity goes away. And so if I tell my students, if what you're wanting to do, if the test is to read through the materials, the printed materials, as quickly and as accurately as possible, if I was going to give you some sort of oral exam where you just stood in front of the class and read, then practicing reading like that would probably be a really good idea. It would be helping prepare you for that task. But that's not really what we're doing. I don't want you just to be able to read the material on the page. I want you to read it, but understand it and remember it and be able to apply it in the future on your own. And in order to know how well you're going to be able to do that, you have to put the book away and practice doing it. And of course, when you try to do that, it's really difficult at first. You don't remember very much, that um, lots of things are forgotten. And that difficulty can make it feel like you're not learning anything, but pushing through those difficulties and recognizing that it's not actually that you're not learning anything. It's just that that's where you are right now. And that's a better assessment of where you are right now, given your goals. That kind of shift in mindset can be really helpful. And what we find then is that when learners engage in retrieval practice, is basically what we're talking about. Retrieval practice, bringing information to mind from memory, describing and explaining it yourself. When we do that, it actually makes you slightly underconfident, which is where I'd rather be. I'd rather be a little bit underconfident than massively overconfident.
So, intuition can both point us toward weak strategies and keep us loyal to them. Even when we tell people about those biases, they often stick with what they've always done. When we try to correct those misconceptions, does that work by explaining to them how these biases actually happen and how they are distorting how they think they're learning?
So that can be kind of a tricky question. Just telling somebody one time, hey, the thing that you've been using your whole life doesn't really work, is probably not going to be the most effective at completely overhauling their behavior, especially if they're not seeing a problem, right? It's not, things haven't gone completely awry. It's just maybe an issue of efficiency or how effective the things might go. Really, what we're asking about is transfer of a skill. And transfer is really difficult to achieve. So what we're trying to do is teach somebody a strategy and then get them to use that strategy in a new scenario or a different scenario from the one that they're currently engaged in. So teaching them a learning strategy and then getting them to apply that learning strategy on their own later when they're learning their own skills or whatever it is that they're trying to learn. Somewhat ironically, the strategies that help people learn are also probably the strategies we ought to use when we're helping them learn how to learn. We're getting very meta at this point. But spacing presentations, retrieval practice, multiple concrete examples, these are all things that should increase how well people learn how to learn. And just telling them one time just isn't part of that effective strategy repertoire.
Or even simply telling people about biases or misconceptions. I have not seen that change how they learn in practice. Awareness alone doesn't overcome habits, convenience, or the pull of strategies that feel easier and more efficient in the moment, which a lot of people default to because they work back in school.
Yeah, and these skills don't live in a vacuum. They tend to build on one another. And so if you learn skill A and then you take a test on skill A, well, then when you learn B, you also still have to know A. And it just becomes this is why it's about efficiency too. You could relearn all of those things every time, but that is just going to take so much time. It's much better to intentionally spread things out.
And like you mentioned, these strategies, they're desirable difficulties, people call them. They're not intuitive in the context of, yes, I feel like they're more efficient in the moment, but over time they're proven effective. And there's a lot of science backing these up. Like to move into some of the myths that people have around learning. I've unpacked quite a few with other guests, but the one that I haven't really touched upon with the other guests, I'd love for you to unpack for our listeners is when we label people as left brain or right brain, and it feels so appealing. How does this limit the learning process?
Yeah, so I think people like brain science. It sounds fancy and very formal, and very serious. And so I think anytime we're talking about things in the brain that might cause, these different types of things, we tend to gravitate towards those ideas and those theories. But also this idea of left-brained and right-brained also kind of lines up with our own experiences in some ways. So we look at one another and we know that we're not all the same. And so when someone comes along and says, "Oh, well, here's, some reason in your brain why some people might be different from you," we know that lots of people are very different. And so it's an appealing idea that differences in our brains might be linked up to differences in the way we act and behave. And that is true. We don't all have exactly the same brain, and there are some differences in the way we process information. It's just that the left right brain thing isn't really one of them. It is true that some tasks tend to be lateralized in the left or the right hemisphere. So, for example, the areas that are responsible or that are heavily responsible for the comprehension of spoken language and the production of spoken language are lateralized in the left hemisphere. And our ability to recognize human faces, specifically upright faces, that fusiform face area, is more lateralized in the right hemisphere. And there's some research, some very cool research with split brain patients where their left and right hemispheres, the corpus callosum, that the information highway that connects those two hemispheres together, has been severed for individuals who suffer from pretty severe epilepsy, for example. Their two hemispheres operate pretty independent or completely independently, actually, as long as you present things just to the left or the right visual field so that it only goes to one hemisphere or the other. And you can find that there are certain tasks that they really can only do if the left hemisphere is recruited or the right hemisphere is recruited. But in reality, we're all using both sides of our brain all the time. And you might be somebody who tends to like spoken language, words, definitions, those kinds of things more so than somebody else. But that doesn't mean that you are using your left brain more than anybody else, or that your right hemisphere is no longer important. There's just some of these lateralized differences where the certain areas in the left or the right are more recruited within a particular activity than others.
And another one that you kind of touched upon that I just want you to dispel as well is that we only use 10% of our brains. I hear this a lot from Hollywood. It's appealing. It's nice to think that that's the case, but I haven't seen that supported by the research.
No. So we are born so much earlier than we probably could be or should be. And my understanding of some of this evolutionary science is that part of the reason is because otherwise our heads wouldn't fit. And so, like, why would we have all of this real estate and then not use it? certainly within evolution that wouldn't have been selected for. No, we definitely use all of our brains all the time. I think the 10% idea is, again, there's grains of truth to this. The way neuroscientists tend to do their research are these subtraction methods. And so they look at what areas of the brain tend to be highly recruited in a particular task, different from just sort of baseline processing or other tasks. And so they'll show that little area of the brain. This is the area that was lighting up in the fMRI scanner when we did this research. But it doesn't mean that that's the area of the brain that was working and the rest of the brain was like asleep during that time. It just means that's the area that was more active during a particular task than it was during another task. But all of our brains were using it all.
Good insight. Thank you for dispelling that. I found that too, that once someone has put themselves in a box regarding left brain and right brain, that I'm not wired for this, it's hard to shake that story, even with good evidence. And that raises a practical challenge for leaders and educators. How do you correct these kinds of myths without accidentally reinforcing them? You've written about refutational teaching, starting with the correct idea, briefly addressing the misconception, and then inoculating learners against it. How can leaders and professional learners use that approach without giving the myth more airtime than it deserves?
So this is tricky. When you talk about the myth, you might reinforce the myth, right? So if we're talking about left and right brained individuals, a passive listener to this episode might say, oh yeah, they talked about left and right brain. The scientist was talking about it. That must mean that there's something to it, right? And there's a risk to that. But at the same time, if we don't mention the myth at all and we only talk about the truth behind it, we run a similar risk. If we don't attack the myth directly, people might not make the link and realize, oh, this means that particular myth isn't true. Or when she's talking about left and right lateralization, she's not talking about left brain, right brain. So I think there's a risk either way. And so we don't want to go on and on and on about the myth and get people to practice retrieval of the myth itself and, continue reinforcing those ideas. But I do think it's important to address the myth and then talk really intentionally about the actual science and spend a lot of time on that. And when we do have individuals, when learners are engaging in retrieval practice, I think you're going to have me talk about this in a little bit in more detail. But you don't need feedback for retrieval practice to be beneficial, but feedback does make that strategy particularly effective. And it can address issues when the wrong information is retrieved. If we then get that feedback, we can better integrate that information in, and we're less likely to reinforce the incorrect idea.
So the order and the emphasis really matter. Lead with the accurate model, touch the misconception just enough to orient people, and then come back to what's true.
I think so. Yep.
So love to move into the technology and AI, because we hear this a lot with learning. In a world full of search engines and AI, the idea that, hey, learning doesn't really matter. Your memory, you don't need it. You can just rely on Google, right? You can just look it up. So from your perspective, why hasn't technology made memory obsolete? And then we'll tackle the learning piece.
So I often find myself, the more time marches on, the older I sound to myself when I start talking about technology. So you need to know and remember enough to know what to look up. If you have no idea what you're even looking for, it's going to be very difficult to look the information up. And it's also going to be very difficult to consume the information that's given to you when you do look it up. So these newer AI tools, the ones that are more conversational, you still need to know the right keywords to use, the best ways to frame the questions. So often when I'm going to professional development training about use of AI or thinking about AI proof assignments for my students, a lot of it revolves around, well, what's the way that you ask AI the question? You have to try to think about different ways to get the question so that you can get the responses that you want or need. And my husband he works a bit in IT, and he talks all the time about using AI to help him frame certain programming questions, but he has to keep trying to get the question right. You have to keep fiddling with it. Well, if you don't know anything, how can you do that? And then whatever technology spits back out to you, it may or may not be correct, or it might be correct, but not for your particular for your particular context, or the example is a little bit off. You have to know enough to work with the technology. You can't just rely on technology. And so I think a little bit, I wish we could just throw AI out the window, and that's where I start to sound old to myself. I'm like, "Who needs it?" But I do think that if we're going to use it in a way that is going to really serve us, we have to use it later than we often want to. We need to know enough in our area to then recruit these AI assistants as an assistant, not as the thought leader of a project.
I'm in agreement with you. Even using technology effectively requires memory, like you mentioned. You must remember what to search for, which sources are trustworthy, and how to interpret and integrate what you find. Tools can store information and extend reach, but they can't replace internal knowledge structures that support understanding, judgment, and expert performance. And from talking to so many leaders and managers, I don't know of a time in a high pressure negotiation in a presentation they could say, wait, let's stop right here. Let me ask AI before we continue. You have to have this knowledge internalized because even in a world of infinite information, you still need enough knowledge in your head to think, to judge, and to know what to ask for. And this connects to that idea of cognitive offloading, using devices and apps as external memory. There's clearly an upside to this, but what do we know from the research about the hidden costs of relying too heavily on tools to remember for us?
Yeah, so it can certainly be helpful to use offloading to support learning efforts. The problem, I think, is when we use it in place of learning. That's when we most often experience a deficit later. So, if we're always going to have a tool available and there really is no real benefit to learning that something yourself, then sure, it might be fine. So, is it worth practicing learning how to memorize your grocery list every week? Or can you just kind of figure that the pen and paper is going to be there? I use, online calendars. I use to-do lists and checklists and things like that. And I think that that's fine. But I often think that we do underestimate the real benefit to learning something sometimes when we're making these decisions. So, I'll try to take a really simple example. I may not need to add two numbers together anymore without a calculator. At this point, I probably can just use a calculator. But having learned about addition in the first place is foundational to other math concepts that I do think that I need to know. And it's allowed me to better understand how to solve other types of problems. And so again, when we're thinking about offloading, if there's something that we need to know because it helps develop our schema, so our internal sort of just understanding about all of these different concepts and the way the concepts link to one another, I do think that we should still engage in learning how to do it initially, because otherwise it's going to make it harder to learn other related things later on.
And like you said, offloading isn't inherently bad. It can free up working memory for higher level thinking when used strategically. But what I find often is the hidden costs appear when it becomes automatic and unreflective, right? So that
Yeah,
the tools replace engagement instead of supporting deeper processing and retrieval. It's real easy to offload too much to it rather than using it for the right purposes.
I agree. Yeah.
You also make somewhat of a counterintuitive claim, which I'd love for you to expand upon, guarding knowledge and memory. Because many people say, hey, I have a bad memory, but I'm a good learner, I'm smart, and they don't really need to practice in developing their memory. You say all knowledge is memory.
The definition that I like to use for memory is the use of the past, our experiences, the information we know, in service of the present or the future. And so that is a much broader definition than I think most people would come up with just on their own. Memory is not just about remembering your wedding day or remembering to pick up your mobile grocery order on time. It includes a lot of things, right? So our memories have these vast networks of information, and all of that information is connected. We have these rich schemas and networks to understand concepts. And so that knowledge is part of your memory. It's part of semantic memory. And we could talk about all different types of memories and the way they connect to one another. So semantic memory, things that you know, episodic memory, remembering specific time and place, knowing how to tie your shoes, knowing how to type on the keyboard, even like knowing what an elephant is and the capital of the state that you live in or the states nearby. All of that is part of your memory. And so in order to be able to learn new information, you have to integrate it with the things that you already know. And all of that is part of this larger system. When I teach about episodic and semantic memory, sometimes students, when they really start to get where they're understanding these different concepts, start to get really tripped up. And they'll say, well, wait a minute. If knowing the first president was George Washington, the first president of the United States was George Washington, is semantic memory. Well, what about knowing who the current president is? Is that, if I remember something specific that the president said, is that semantic or is it episodic? Things start to blur. You learn information in an episodic way. We have time and place stamps on these things, but slowly those things start to fade away and we start to just sort of develop our general concept of that. And that really is kind of what learning is all about, integrating these different pieces together. And so I think it's important to recognize that all of this is memory and all of it's recruited during learning, and those specific time and date stamps can be important at the outset.
You're right. I can't agree with you more. And just to reemphasize, memory is a foundational element of all learning. If you can't retrieve something, you can't use it in reasoning or performance. So functionally, inaccessible knowledge, right, is the equivalent to no knowledge at all. This is why techniques that strengthen retrieval, such as spaced and varied practice, are so central to building expertise. And you mentioned something in your last response I just would love for you to expand upon, because this is not common to many adult learners, is you want to connect new information to what you already know. You don't want to try to memorize it as disparate facts to something new, always trying to connect it. And it's because knowledge is cumulative and it's exponential. Once you know something about a topic, you learn it faster. And that basis of foundation of knowledge really helps you in the learning process.
Yeah, this gets at these areas of understanding experts versus novice learners. And novices don't have that structure. They don't have the prior knowledge to integrate the new stuff in with the stuff that they already know. And so that makes it more difficult for them to learn. And so you want to tap into that background knowledge. And importantly, you want to make sure you don't short circuit your background knowledge. This is why kind of maintaining those things and not doing too much cognitive offloading is important. You don't want to forget all of that basic foundational information, because that's really going to help you learn the newer skills that you need. Essentially, when you are more expert, when you have more background knowledge, it allows you to create, you've already created this schema, this network in your head of how different concepts relate to one another. And integrating new information into that schema is easier than building the schema totally from scratch. It also means that when you're taking in new information, you have a lower demand on your working memory, which is a limited resource. So our working memory is basically the information that we're holding on to in the moment, the things that we're working with right now. So as I'm speaking, you're listening to what I'm saying and you're holding the words in your head and you're trying to kind of piece it all together. And that's all happening in your working memory. But your working memory is of a limited capacity. You can only hold on to so much. Experts don't have to hold as many individual pieces because it's connected for them. It's like creating these larger chunks, things that they just know that they can pull up at a whim rather than having to try to hold on to it. And so the expert is better able to learn more effectively and efficiently, in part because they aren't using as many resources to try to hold on to these different things.
You bring up a great distinction between experts and novices. The curse of knowledge. Experts talk in the abstract. Abstract ideas don't naturally stick with beginners. They can't see the deeper structure, so they rely on the surface structure instead. How can we make those abstract ideas easier to remember for novices?
Yeah, abstract ideas are just more difficult. They're abstract. They're harder to hold on to. We have an easier time when we have concrete examples of the abstract ideas. This can sometimes go along with mental imagery. It's easier to mentally imagine a concrete idea than it is to mentally imagine an abstract idea. And when you try to imagine something abstract, usually you come up with kind of a concrete example. Oftentimes, novices do focus on those surface features rather than that underlying structure because they just don't know what is and is not important about an example. And they don't know how far they can extend an example or how limited an example might be. And so, like, let's take the idea of scarcity. If I were to explain scarcity to somebody, and I'm not an economics expert, but if I were to explain it, I'd say, well, it's all about supply and demand. Take tickets on an airline, for example. At least before this used to be the case. Things have gotten a little wonky lately, but it used to be, right, that when you bought plane tickets relatively early, far enough before the flight, they would be less expensive. And as you got closer and closer to the flight date and seats became fewer and fewer, more and more scarce, the ticket price would rise. It's also certain times of the year where the ticket prices are just higher because they know that the demand is going to be higher than the supply, and so they can raise the cost. So if I give that example, a novice might latch onto this idea of tickets and might think, oh, that's the concept about flying. And maybe scarcity only applies to airlines or only applies to tickets. They might latch onto the wrong thing or integrate it really heavily with that idea of tickets. And they might be less likely to apply the idea in areas where the surface details are totally different. So, one way to combat this is to give multiple concrete examples with those different surface features. And the different surface features is important. If I were to give a second example and start talking about concert ticket sales, I've now doubled down on this idea that scarcity is about tickets. And so, giving another example that is quite different can be helpful, and helping the learner to make the link to say, okay, what are the same about these concepts? What makes them both about scarcity? So if I give another example about water and a drought, so water being scarce in a drought, and let's say you're only allowed to use so much water in a day, you're now going to spend that water on things that are much more important and necessary compared to other things. You're going to save it for drinking, cooking, maybe bathing, depending on how much you're allowed to use, but you're certainly not going to say, oh, now is a great time to drain the pool and refill it. Or now is a great time to let the kids have a water balloon fight or just like play in the sprinkler. You don't even really water plants necessarily unless that's part of your food source. In a drought, the way you treat that scarce resource is different. And by using two examples with different surface features, we can start to get that underlying structure. So I think it's common to present an idea and then give an example of that idea. What we want to do is go beyond just the one example, try to give multiple examples with different surface features, and really spend the time figuring out what are the commonalities underneath so that the novice or the relative novice can help extract that underlying principle. The curse of knowledge comes into play here because the expert, person doing the teaching, often sees the connection very easily and thinks that they've explained that connection quite well, when in reality, I hope this isn't happening for me right now. In reality, they're talking about it, but some of it is implied, and the novice doesn't necessarily make that connection.
Great insights there. And I've seen that as well. To support transfer, people need multiple examples that differ on the surface, but embody the same core idea, paired with explicit guidance on what's constant across them. That's often not the case, where they just give examples and expect the students to understand that deep idea, which takes time for them to do. But without that contrast and explanation, memory tends to be tied to the original scenario, and learners struggle to recognize when and how to apply the principles in new situations, which really talks to that transfer piece. Because for adult learners, they want to be able to retain it. That speaks to the memory piece, making sure it's in your head, but also be able to retrieve it and apply it in new contexts. Have you seen any techniques or strategies that really help to improve the transfer in real world situations?
Yeah, so this is tough. When we learn something, it tends to be incredibly contextualized. And this makes sense in some ways, right? We tend to remember things in a very contextualized way, which is probably a good thing in many contexts. But unfortunately, it also means that when we would want something to just transfer all across the board, it doesn't always happen automatically. And so if you know when you are most likely to use particular information, it's a good idea to try to ground yourself in those types of examples to help you really see the connection to that particular domain. Or if you know that you're going to use it in a couple areas, practice in those areas. So multiple concrete examples with spaced practice, so spacing over time, and retrieval practice is going to be helpful. If you're not sure exactly where else you might use it, if We're thinking about more creative applications that you haven't yet thought of, maybe nobody in your field has thought of yet. One way to try to make that more likely to occur is to try to vary the examples as much as possible. So cast as wide a net as you can, which makes it more likely that you're going to notice some connection in the future, even if it's not one you've specifically practiced. And getting in the habit of doing this and continuously reminding yourself and remembering some of the old information can make it more likely that you'll see those connections.
There's one idea to carry with you from this episode. Learning isn't what feels clear in the moment. Learning is what you can use later, especially under pressure. Most professionals don't struggle because they lack intelligence, motivation, or experience. They struggle because their learning was never designed to survive real world conditions. It was built for familiarity, not retrieval, for insight, not transfer. That's why upgrading how you learn matters so much, not as a return to school, but as a force multiplier for every other skill you're trying to build. If knowledge is memory, then performance depends on access. And if you can't retrieve it, well, then guess what? You can't use it. And if it doesn't transfer, does it really even matter? So here's the real test to take into this week. Don't ask, did this make sense? Instead, ask the question, will I remember this when it counts? If the answer isn't clear, redesign the learning, not the person. That's how capability is actually built, and that's how learning becomes a competitive advantage. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.